Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Burn. The steam from the iron hissed like a serpent as Miranda Caldwell pressed the heated metal against her 23-year-old daughter's forearm. Crystal Lancaster's scream pierced through the suburban evening, a sound that would haunt the Caldwell household forever. Trash deserves to burn. Miranda laughed, her voice carrying a venom that seemed foreign coming from a woman who had once sung lullabies to the same child, now writhing in pain on the kitchen floor. Brian Raymond, Crystal's 25-year-old half-brother, watched from the doorway with cold amusement. "If I were her, I'd have burned her face too," he snorted, adjusting his designer jacket, a gift from his mother's latest shopping spree. Aaron Haley stood in the shadows of the hallway, his weathered hands clenched into fists. At 52, he had built an empire from nothing, a construction company that employed over 300 people across the state. His steel-gray eyes, which had intimidated union negotiators and corrupt politicians alike, now burned with a fury that made his professional reputation seem tame. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply watched as his wife of 15 years revealed her true nature, and his stepson, the boy he had raised since age 10, showed his gratitude with cruelty. Aaron had met Miranda when Crystal was 8 and Brian was 10. Their father, a deadbeat named Thomas Lancaster, had abandoned them for a cocktail waitress in Vegas. Aaron had stepped in, not just as a provider, but as a father figure who had funded Brian's college education, bought Crystal her first car, and treated them as his own blood. The burn would heal, but the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. As Miranda tended to her manicured nails, seemingly forgetting the child writhing on the floor, Aaron made his decision. He knelt beside Crystal, his calloused hands gentle as he examined the iron-shaped wound on her forearm. "We're leaving," he told her quietly. "Aaron, don't be dramatic," Miranda called from across the kitchen, not even turning around. She had it coming. Little bitch was disrespecting me in my own house. Crystal's offense had been questioning why her mother needed another shopping trip when Aaron was working 70-hour weeks to maintain their lifestyle. The girl worked 2 jobs, waiting tables and cleaning offices, trying to save for nursing school while living at home. Aaron helped Crystal to her feet, noting how Brian smirked at his sister's pain. The boy had always been Miranda's favorite, spoiled and entitled despite Aaron's attempts to instill work ethic and respect. Now Aaron saw the rot that had been growing beneath the surface. "Pack your things," Aaron told Crystal. "Both of you." Miranda finally turned, her Botox-frozen forehead unable to furrow despite her confusion. "What are you talking about? You burned my daughter. Your son thinks it's funny. I'm done." "Your daughter." Brian stepped forward, his 6-foot frame trying to intimidate. "She's not your blood, old man. None of us are." Aaron's smile was colder than a Montana winter. "You're right. And you just reminded me why that matters." As Crystal gathered her few belongings, Aaron made a phone call to his lawyer, Carl Welch, then another to his accountant, Stuart Hunter. By morning, the wheels would be in motion. Miranda laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You think you can just leave? I'll take half of everything you've built, Aaron. I know about the offshore accounts, the shell companies. My lawyer will destroy you." Aaron's expression didn't change. He had built his fortune through calculation, patience, and the ability to see 10 moves ahead. Miranda had just revealed she'd been digging into his finances, something that explained certain discrepancies he'd noticed in his accounts. "We'll see," was all he said. That night, Aaron and Crystal checked into a hotel suite downtown. As Crystal slept, exhausted from pain and emotional trauma, Aaron sat on the balcony overlooking the city he had helped build. Construction cranes bearing his company's logo dotted the skyline like metal sentinels. He thought about Miranda's confidence, her smug certainty that she held all the cards. She had clearly been planning this for a while, probably encouraged by someone who knew enough about divorce proceedings to feel bold. Aaron pulled out his phone and scrolled through Miranda's contacts, something he'd memorized years ago out of protective instinct. One name stood out: Seth Flowers, Miranda's personal trainer, who had been making frequent appearances in their home while Aaron worked. A few discreet phone calls to his security contacts revealed what he'd suspected. Miranda and Seth had been carrying on an affair for over a year. The trainer, a failed actor turned fitness instructor, had expensive tastes and mounting debts. Aaron smiled as he pieced together the puzzle. Seth had been feeding Miranda information about asset protection and divorce strategies, probably from his own experience with a messy divorce from his first wife. They had been planning to take Aaron for everything he was worth. But Aaron Haley had been playing games of strategy since he was a child, surviving in Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. These suburban schemers had no idea who they were dealing with. As dawn broke over the city, Aaron began making a list, not of assets to protect or lawyers to call, but of pressure points and weaknesses. Every person had them, triggers that could unravel their entire world if pressed correctly. Miranda loved her social status and her position as a respected member of the country club set. Seth craved legitimacy and acceptance in circles that had always looked down on him. Brian depended on his mother's support and his stepfather's connections to maintain his lifestyle. Aaron had given them everything. Now he would take it all back, piece by piece, and watch them destroy themselves in the process. The game was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Discovery. 3 days after the iron incident, Aaron sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Haley building, reviewing the intelligence his private investigator had gathered. Todd Mayer was the best in the business, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate espionage and domestic investigations. "It's worse than we thought," Todd said, sliding a thick folder across Aaron's mahogany desk. "The affair started 14 months ago. Seth Flowers isn't just her trainer. He's been positioning himself as her business advisor." Aaron opened the folder, his face remaining impassive as he reviewed photographs, financial records, and recorded conversations. Miranda and Seth had been meeting regularly at the Riverside Hotel, but they'd also been conducting meetings with lawyers, real estate agents, and investment advisors. "They've been planning the divorce for months," Todd continued. "Seth convinced her to start documenting your emotional abuse and controlling behavior. She's been building a case for spousal abuse to maximize her settlement." The irony wasn't lost on Aaron. While Miranda crafted false narratives of abuse, she had literally branded his daughter with a hot iron. "There's more," Todd said, producing a second set of documents. "Seth owes money to some very unpleasant people. His gambling debts total close to $200,000, and his creditors aren't the type to accept payment plans." Aaron studied a surveillance photo of Seth meeting with 2 men outside a casino. Even from a distance, their body language screamed intimidation. "Your wife has been secretly liquidating assets to help pay his debts," Todd continued. "She sold jewelry, took cash advances on credit cards, even borrowed against your daughter's college fund." Aaron's jaw tightened. Crystal had been working herself to exhaustion, believing she needed to save every penny for nursing school, while her mother stole from her future to fund her affair. The investigation revealed more disturbing details. Brian wasn't just complicit in his mother's schemes. He was actively participating. The boy had been feeding Seth information about Aaron's business dealings, using his access to the family's private spaces to photograph documents and record conversations. "Brian's been promised a partnership in a new business venture," Todd explained. "Seth convinced Miranda that you'd never put the boy in your will as a real son, so they needed to secure his future independently." Aaron pulled up Brian's financial records on his computer. The boy had been living far beyond his means. Expensive clothes, restaurant bills, a BMW lease that cost more than most people's mortgages, all funded by credit cards that Miranda co-signed. The family Aaron had built and protected for 15 years had been systematically betraying him while he worked himself to exhaustion providing for them. But the deepest cut came in the final pages of Todd's report. Audio recordings from the house, obtained through security cameras Aaron had installed for protection, revealed conversations between Miranda and Brian about Crystal. "She's not even his real daughter," Miranda's voice crackled through the speakers. "And she's always been a pathetic little mouse. Aaron only keeps her around out of guilt." Brian's laughter followed. "She'll never amount to anything anyway. Might as well put her in her place now." Aaron had heard enough. He dismissed Todd and sat alone in his office as the sun, set over the city. From his window, he could see the construction site where his latest project was taking shape, a medical complex that would employ hundreds and serve thousands. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in poverty with an alcoholic father and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. Every success, every achievement had been earned through blood, sweat, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Miranda came from privilege, but had squandered every opportunity. Seth was a parasite who targeted successful people to fund his failures. Brian had been handed every advantage, but chose entitlement over effort. They had confused Aaron's generosity for weakness, his love for stupidity. Now, they would learn the difference between a provider and a predator. Aaron made his first call to Randall Dotson, a lawyer who specialized in asset protection and complex corporate structures. The second call went to Clay Abbott, a real estate developer who had been trying to buy one of Aaron's prime properties for years. By midnight, Aaron had restructured his entire financial empire. Shell companies were dissolved, assets were transferred, and ownership structures were reorganized. Miranda would find that the money she thought she could claim had vanished like smoke. But financial protection was just the beginning. Aaron's Real plan required patience, precision, and a deep understanding of human psychology. He pulled up the contact information for Enrique McCormick, the best private security consultant on the West Coast. Enrique had helped Aaron deal with union disputes and corporate sabotage in the past, but this job would require more creative solutions. The final call went to Mark Mead, a media consultant who specialized in reputation management. Aaron had a story to tell, and he wanted to make sure it reached the right audiences at the right time. As Aaron left his office that night, he stopped by the construction site where it all began. 23 years ago, he had started with nothing but a pickup truck and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Every building, every success, every dollar had been earned through determination and strategic thinking. Miranda, Seth, and Brian thought they were playing checkers. They had no idea Aaron had already begun a game of chess where he controlled every piece on the board. The first move had been made when they chose betrayal over loyalty. Now Aaron would show them how a real strategist plays to win. Chapter 3. The Foundation. Aaron stood in the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, watching as Enrique McCormick's team set up surveillance equipment and communication systems. The building, officially condemned and scheduled for demolition, would serve as headquarters for what Aaron privately called Operation Reset. The beauty of this location, Enrique explained as he tested camera feeds, is that it doesn't exist on paper anymore. City records show it was demolished last month. Aaron nodded, appreciating the irony. Like his marriage, this building appeared intact on the surface while being fundamentally destroyed underneath. Crystal sat at a makeshift desk, her bandaged arm resting carefully as she reviewed documents. Despite her pain, she had insisted on helping with the research. The burn mark would fade, but her trust in family had been permanently scarred. "I found something interesting about Seth's background," she said, holding up a file. "His real name is Seth Flowers, but he used to go by Stephen Fletcher when he was married to his first wife." Aaron examined the documents. Seth had changed his name after a messy divorce that left him bankrupt and facing assault charges. Charges that were dropped when his ex-wife mysteriously withdrew her complaint and left the state. "There's a pattern here," Crystal continued. "He targets older women, usually divorced or widowed, with substantial assets. Miranda is his third mark in 5 years." The research revealed Seth's methodology: establish himself as a fitness trainer at upscale gyms, identify wealthy female clients going through emotional transitions, and slowly insert himself into their lives as both lover and financial advisor. His first victim lost her house, Crystal read from the file. The second one ended up declaring bankruptcy. Seth always manages to walk away clean while they lose everything. Aaron felt a cold satisfaction as the pieces fell into place. Seth wasn't just an opportunistic parasite. He was a career predator who had chosen the wrong target. Mark Mead arrived at noon with a van full of video equipment and a team of journalists who specialized in investigative exposés. Aaron had hired them to document everything, but not for the reasons anyone expected. "The story you want to tell, Mark explained as his team set up cameras, isn't about revenge. It's about protection. You're a successful businessman whose family was infiltrated by a con artist, and you're taking steps to protect other potential victims. The narrative was perfect. Aaron would be seen as a concerned citizen exposing a dangerous criminal, not a husband seeking vengeance. The documentation would serve multiple purposes: evidence for legal proceedings, material for public exposure, and insurance against any attempts by Miranda and Seth to rewrite history. That afternoon, Aaron met with Willard Sweeney, a forensic accountant who had helped him navigate complex business deals in the past. Willard had been analyzing Miranda's financial activities, and the results were damning. She's been systematically embezzling from your personal accounts, Willard reported. Small amounts at first, but increasing over time. The total is approaching 6 figures. That's not embezzlement, Aaron corrected. Those are joint accounts. Legally, she had every right to withdraw that money. Willard smiled. Not if the funds were being used to commit fraud or support criminal activities. Seth's gambling debts aren't just markers at legitimate casinos. He owes money to loan sharks connected to organized crime. The distinction was crucial. Miranda thought she was funding an affair, but she was actually laundering money for criminal enterprises. The federal implications would multiply her legal exposure exponentially. As evening approached, Aaron received updates from his various team members. Stuart Hunter reported that the financial restructuring was complete. Miranda would find that her access to Aaron's wealth had vanished overnight. Carl Welch confirmed that divorce papers were being prepared with terms that would shock Miranda's legal team. But the most interesting update came from Jimmy Nichols, a private investigator who specialized in background checks for Aaron's construction company. Jimmy had been researching Brian's activities and discovered something unexpected. Your stepson has been selling information about your business dealings, Jimmy reported. But not just to Seth. He's been in contact with competitors, union organizers, and at least 2 government investigators. Aaron felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. Brian's betrayal went far beyond family disloyalty. It was corporate espionage that could have destroyed Aaron's business and put hundreds of people out of work. There's more, Jimmy continued. He's been using his access to your home office to photograph sensitive documents. Some of those photos ended up in the hands of people who've been trying to undermine your contract for years. The revelation added a new dimension to Aaron's plans. Brian wasn't just a spoiled child supporting his mother's affair. He was actively sabotaging the business that had paid for his education, his car, and his lifestyle. As Aaron reviewed all the intelligence gathered over the past week, he began to see the full scope of the conspiracy against him. Miranda, Seth, and Brian had been working together to destroy him systematically while positioning themselves to profit from the wreckage. They had underestimated him completely. Aaron had built his empire by understanding that every problem contained the seeds of its own solution. Every weakness in an enemy's plan created an opportunity for counterattack. Aaron opened his laptop and began typing detailed instructions for each member of his team. The plan he was implementing would unfold over several weeks, with each phase building on the previous one until his enemies found themselves trapped in a web of their own making. The first phase would target their finances and social standing. The second would expose their crimes and betrayals. The third would ensure they face consequences that would last for years. Aaron had learned long ago that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and forgiveness was frequently repaid with fresh betrayal. He had given Miranda, Seth, and Brian every opportunity to choose loyalty over greed, family over self-interest. They had made their choice. Now Aaron would show them the consequences of betraying someone who had clawed his way out of poverty and built an empire through sheer force of will. The foundation for their destruction was complete. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Chapter 4. The Pressure Points. Miranda Caldwell woke up to discover that her credit cards had been canceled overnight. When she called the bank to complain, she was transferred to a supervisor who informed her that Mr. Haley had restructured all accounts and removed her as an authorized user. That's impossible, Miranda shrieked into the phone. I'm his wife. I have rights. Ma'am, according to our records, these were business accounts that Mr. Haley personally guaranteed. He has every legal right to manage access to his own credit facilities. Miranda threw the phone across her bedroom, barely missing the mirror that reflected her rage-contorted face. She called Seth immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. What Miranda didn't know was that Seth was sitting in a parking garage across town, staring at two men who had paid him a very unfriendly visit. His gambling debts had come due, and his creditors weren't interested in excuses. 2 weeks, the larger man said, adjusting his brass knuckles. You get us our money in 2 weeks, or we start collecting in other ways. Seth's hands shook as he tried calling Miranda, but her phone was busy. He didn't know that Aaron's team had been monitoring his communications and had arranged for both problems to surface simultaneously. Meanwhile, Brian Raymond was having his own crisis at his downtown apartment. His BMW had been repossessed in the night, and his landlord was demanding 3 months of back rent that Brian couldn't pay. His mother's credit cards, which had been funding his lifestyle, were no longer working. This is all Aaron's fault, Brian muttered, throwing his clothes into garbage bags. His expensive wardrobe, paid for with Aaron's money, was all he had left of value. But Brian's problems were just beginning. At his part-time job as a consultant for his mother's social circle, he discovered that word had somehow spread about his disloyalty to Aaron. In the tight-knit business community Aaron had spent decades building, Brian found himself persona non grata overnight. Aaron watched the chaos unfold from his command center in the warehouse, where multiple screens showed surveillance feeds, news reports, and financial data. Crystal sat beside him, her healing arm no longer hindering her ability to coordinate the operation. Seth's creditors are increasing pressure, she reported, monitoring communications intercepts. He's desperate enough to do something stupid. That stupidity came sooner than expected. Seth broke into Miranda's house that afternoon, searching for jewelry and valuables he could liquidate quickly. What he found instead was Aaron, sitting calmly in the living room with a cup of coffee. Hello, Seth. Looking for something? Seth froze, a gold necklace halfway into his pocket. Miranda said I could. Miranda says a lot of things, Aaron replied, his voice conversational. Most of them lies. Would you like to sit down? We should talk. The conversation that followed was recorded by hidden cameras that Aaron's team had installed throughout the house. Seth, panicked about his debts and desperate for solutions, admitted to everything. The affair, the financial planning, the scheme to take Aaron's assets, even Brian's role as an informant. She promised me half of everything, Seth said, his desperation making him careless. The business, the houses, the investments. Miranda said you were stupid and weak, that you'd never see it coming. Aaron nodded sympathetically. And what did you promise her in return? A new life. Freedom from a husband who never appreciated her. Seth's voice took on a rehearsed quality, as if he'd practiced these lines. She deserves better than someone who just works all the time. I see. And Brian? What role does he play in this new life? Seth shifted uncomfortably. The kid's useful. He has access to your files, your computer. We needed someone inside to make sure we didn't miss anything valuable. Every word was being recorded in high definition, creating a permanent record of the conspiracy. Aaron had what he needed, but he wasn't finished yet. There's just one problem with your plan, Aaron said, still speaking in the same calm tone. You assumed I was stupid and weak. What if you were wrong? The realization dawned slowly on Seth's face as he noticed the cameras, the recording equipment, the fact that Aaron was completely relaxed despite catching him in the act of burglary. This was a setup, Seth whispered. This was justice, Aaron corrected. You're a career criminal who targets vulnerable women. Miranda isn't your first victim, and she wouldn't have been your last. Aaron stood up, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the trembling younger man. But she will be your last, because I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you are. That evening, Aaron's team executed the next phase of the plan. The recorded confession was edited into a documentary-style presentation and sent to every member of Miranda's social circle, every client at Seth Gym, and every business associate who had ever dealt with Brian. The response was immediate and devastating. Miranda's country club friends stopped taking her calls. Seth's training clients canceled their sessions and demanded refunds. Brian's consulting work dried up as word spread about his corporate espionage. But Aaron wasn't content with social exile. He wanted complete destruction. The security footage of Seth burglarizing the house was delivered to the police, along with evidence of his fraud, gambling debts, and connections to organized crime. The audio recordings of Brian discussing corporate secrets were forwarded to federal investigators who had been monitoring Aaron's business for years, looking for any excuse to bring him down. Now those same investigators had evidence that Aaron was the victim, not the perpetrator of corporate espionage. Miranda received divorce papers that evening, along with a complete accounting of her theft from family accounts. The documents, prepared by Carl Welch, were masterpieces of legal precision that left her with virtually no claim to Aaron's assets. "Irreconcilable differences," she read aloud, her voice rising with each word. "He's claiming irreconcilable differences because I disciplined my own daughter?" Brian, now homeless and facing federal investigation, tried to rally his mother. "We can fight this. We can expose his business dealings, his offshore accounts." "With what money?" Miranda snapped. "Our lawyer won't even take our calls without a retainer we can't pay." As mother and son faced the collapse of their schemes, Aaron was already planning the next phase. Financial and social destruction was satisfying, but he wanted them to understand the full consequences of their betrayal. The real pain was just beginning. Chapter 5: The Squeeze. The Riverside Hotel, where Miranda and Seth had conducted their affair, became the setting for Seth's downfall. Aaron had purchased the failing business through one of his shell companies, and the new management was very interested in investigating irregularities in their previous operations. Security footage from the past year was mysteriously discovered and turned over to law enforcement, showing Seth and Miranda's meetings, but also revealing something more damaging: Seth's drug transactions with hotel guests and staff. "We had no idea," the new manager told reporters as Channel 7 news cameras rolled. "When Mr. Haley's company acquired this property, we immediately began reviewing security procedures and discovered evidence of serious criminal activity." Seth watched the news report from a seedy motel room, his world collapsing around him. The drug charges were secondary to his real problem. His gambling creditors had seen the same news report and correctly concluded that he would never be able to pay them. Miranda fared no better. Her attempt to claim spousal support was demolished in court when Aaron's lawyers presented evidence of her theft, adultery, and abuse of Crystal. The judge, a woman with little patience for child abusers, awarded Aaron full custody of Crystal and ordered Miranda to pay restitution. "Your Honor," Miranda's court-appointed lawyer pleaded, "my client has no income and no assets with which to pay restitution." Then perhaps she should have considered that before stealing from her daughter's college fund and burning the child with a hot iron. Judge Diane Quinn replied coldly. Brian's situation was even worse. The federal investigation into his corporate espionage had expanded to include his connections to Seth's criminal activities. Prosecutors were offering him a plea deal that would require him to testify against his mother and Seth in exchange for a reduced sentence. "They want me to wear a wire," Brian told Miranda during one of their few remaining conversations. "They think you and Seth are part of some larger conspiracy." Miranda laughed bitterly. "Conspiracy? We couldn't even pull off a simple divorce without everything falling apart." What neither Miranda nor Brian understood was that their failures weren't due to bad luck or poor planning. They were the result of Aaron's systematic destruction of every foundation they had built their schemes upon. Aaron had used his business connections to ensure that Miranda couldn't find employment anywhere in the city. Seth's gym had fired him after clients complained about the criminal charges, and his personal training license was under review. Brian's reputation in the business community was so thoroughly destroyed that he couldn't even get hired as a delivery driver. But Aaron's masterpiece was yet to come. Through his media consultant Mark Mead, Aaron had been building a narrative about Seth as a serial predator who targeted vulnerable women. The story was picked up by national news outlets, with Miranda portrayed as Seth's latest victim rather than his willing accomplice. She was brainwashed by a master manipulator, one expert explained on television. These predators are skilled at identifying women going through difficult transitions and exploiting their emotional vulnerability. The narrative served Aaron's purposes perfectly. It painted Miranda as a victim rather than a villain, which made her actual crimes seem even more shocking when they were eventually revealed. Public sympathy for a brainwashed woman would quickly turn to disgust when people learned she had burned her own daughter. Seth, meanwhile, was dealing with more immediate problems. His creditors had escalated from threats to action, vandalizing his car and following him to his new job at a discount fitness center. When he tried to flee the city, he was arrested at the airport on the drug charges stemming from the hotel investigation. Bail is set at $500,000, the judge announced, knowing full well that Seth had no way to raise such an amount. From his jail cell, Seth tried to contact Miranda, hoping she might have access to funds that could help him. What he didn't know was that Miranda was facing her own legal crisis. Aaron had filed a civil lawsuit against Miranda for theft, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit, designed more for publicity than recovery, detailed every aspect of her betrayal and included graphic photos of Crystal's burn injuries. Local newspapers picked up the story, and Miranda found herself cast as a child abuser and gold digger who had stolen from her own daughter to fund an affair with a career criminal. The evidence shows a pattern of calculated cruelty, Aaron's lawyer told reporters. Ms. Caldwell didn't just betray her husband. She systematically abused and exploited the children in her care. Miranda's attempts to generate sympathy were undermined by her own recorded words, which Aaron's team strategically leaked to media outlets. Her laughter as Crystal writhed in pain, her casual dismissal of the injury, and her cruel comments about her daughter's worth destroyed any chance of public support. Brian's situation deteriorated further when prosecutors offered him immunity in exchange for testimony against his mother. The federal charges related to corporate espionage carried potential sentences of up to 20 years, making cooperation his only realistic option. "She's my mother," Brian protested to his lawyer. "She's also the reason you're facing federal charges," the lawyer replied bluntly. "She encouraged you to steal from the man who raised you, educated you, and treated you as his own son. Now that man is willing to let you walk away if you tell the truth about what happened." The truth, Brian discovered, was more damaging than he had realized. Aaron's investigators had documented every aspect of the conspiracy, from the initial affair to the planned asset seizure. Brian's cooperation would simply confirm what Aaron already knew and had extensively documented. As the legal proceedings moved forward, Aaron continued his campaign of systematic destruction. He used his influence to ensure that Miranda's story reached the attention of child welfare organizations, women's advocacy groups, and victim rights activists. The irony was deliberate. Miranda had expected to portray herself as a victim of Aaron's alleged abuse, but instead found herself condemned by the very groups she had hoped would support her. Seth, still in jail and facing mounting pressure from both prosecutors and creditors, finally agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for protective custody. His confession included detailed testimony about Miranda's role in planning the asset seizure and Brian's corporate espionage activities. "She wasn't a victim," Seth told prosecutors, abandoning his former lover to save himself. "She was the ringleader. The whole thing was her idea from the beginning." Aaron watched the dominoes fall from his office, overlooking the city he had helped build. Each revelation, each betrayal, each desperate attempt to escape consequences only deepened the hole his enemies had dug for themselves. But he wasn't finished yet. The final phase of his plan would ensure that their destruction was permanent and complete. Chapter 6: The Revelation. The courtroom was packed with media, social activists, and curious onlookers as Miranda Caldwell's trial began. Aaron sat in the front row beside Crystal, whose healed arm bore only a faint scar, but whose testimony would be devastating. District Attorney Freddie Mullen had built his case methodically, using the mountain of evidence Aaron's team had gathered. The charges included child abuse, theft, fraud, and conspiracy, a combination that could result in decades in prison. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mullen began his opening statement, This case is about the systematic abuse and exploitation of a family by someone they trusted completely. The defendant didn't just burn her daughter with a hot iron. She orchestrated a complex scheme to destroy the man who had provided for her family for 15 years. Miranda's defense attorney, an overworked public defender named Guadalupe Green, tried to maintain the narrative that Miranda had been manipulated by Seth. But that strategy crumbled when prosecutors revealed recordings of Miranda discussing the scheme before she had ever met Seth. The first bombshell came from Brian's testimony. In exchange for immunity, he had agreed to reveal everything, including details that Aaron hadn't previously known. She started planning to leave Aaron about 2 years ago, Brian testified, avoiding his mother's furious glare. But she wanted to make sure she got as much money as possible. She researched his business, talked to lawyers, even hired a private investigator to look for evidence of affairs or financial crimes. The revelation that Miranda had been planning her betrayal for years, long before Seth appeared, destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for her. But the most shocking testimony came from an unexpected source. Ethel Lancaster, Crystal's biological grandmother, who had remained silent for years about her daughter-in-law's true nature. "Miranda called me 3 years ago," the elderly woman testified, her voice shaking with emotion. "She wanted to know if Crystal had any inheritance coming from her father's side. When I told her there wasn't anything significant, she said, 'Then the little bitch is worthless to me.'" The courtroom erupted at this revelation. Miranda had been calculating Crystal's financial value to her even before the affair began, treating her stepdaughter as nothing more than a potential asset. Crystal's own testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. She described not just the burning incident, but years of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and deliberate sabotage of her education and career goals. "She told me I wasn't smart enough for college," Crystal said, her voice steady despite her tears. "She said Aaron was wasting money on my education because I'd never amount to anything. But she was spending that same money on clothes, jewelry, and trips with Seth." Aaron watched Miranda's face as Crystal spoke, seeing no remorse or regret, only anger at being exposed. Even facing prison, Miranda couldn't summon any genuine emotion for the daughter she had tortured. The prosecution's case was devastating, but Aaron had one final surprise prepared. Through his connections in law enforcement, he had learned that Seth's criminal history went back much further than anyone had realized. Detective Reginald Drake took the stand to reveal that Seth had been connected to at least 5 other cases involving fraud against older women, including one that had resulted in a woman's suicide when she lost her life savings. The defendant's affair wasn't just adultery, Drake testified. It was part of a pattern of financial predation that has destroyed lives across 3 states. The revelation that Miranda had unknowingly partnered with a serial killer of dreams, someone whose schemes had literally driven a woman to suicide, shocked even Aaron. He had expected to find a garden-variety predator, not someone whose crimes had such devastating consequences. Miranda's lawyer tried desperately to salvage the case by arguing that her client had been manipulated by a master criminal, but the recorded conversations between Miranda and Seth told a different story. In them, Miranda was clearly the dominant partner, directing Seth's actions and making strategic decisions. She wasn't a victim, Seth testified via video link from federal prison, having already been convicted on multiple counts. "She was smarter than me, more ruthless. The iron thing was all her idea." She said Crystal needed to learn respect. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was swift and decisive, guilty on all counts. Judge Quinn's sentencing was equally harsh. "Ms. Caldwell, you have shown a level of cruelty and calculation that shocks the conscience. You burned your own daughter, stole from her future, and conspired to destroy the man who treated you and your children as family. The court sentences you to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. Miranda collapsed as the sentence was read, finally understanding that her schemes had not just failed, they had destroyed her completely. Aaron felt no satisfaction in her tears. Justice had been served, but the damage to his family could never be fully repaired. As they left the courthouse, Crystal squeezed Aaron's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Aaron looked at the young woman who had emerged stronger from her ordeal, now preparing to start nursing school with his full support. "You're my daughter," he said. "That means something to me, even if it didn't to her." The media coverage of the trial had an unexpected consequence. Several other women came forward with stories of being targeted by men using Seth's methods. Aaron found himself inadvertently leading a campaign to expose financial predators who targeted vulnerable women. But privately, Aaron was already moving on to the next phase of his life. With Miranda and Seth in prison and Brian facing his own consequences, he was free to build something new with Crystal, a family based on loyalty, respect, and genuine affection. The old Aaron might have felt guilty about the ruthless efficiency of his revenge, but that Aaron had been too trusting, too forgiving. The new Aaron understood that some betrayals could never be forgiven, and some people deserved exactly what they brought upon themselves. Justice, Aaron had learned, wasn't always pretty, but it was always necessary. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 6 months after Miranda's sentencing, Aaron stood in the construction site of the Crystal Haley Medical Center, a trauma treatment facility he was building in his daughter's honor. The irony wasn't lost on him that a building dedicated to healing would rise from the ashes of such destruction. Crystal had thrived since the trial, excelling in her nursing program and working part-time at the Children's Hospital. The burn scar on her arm had faded to a thin white line, but the strength she had gained from surviving her ordeal was permanent. The Psychological Evaluation Center will be on the 3rd floor, Crystal explained to Aaron as they reviewed architectural plans, specifically designed for children who've suffered abuse. Aaron nodded, proud of how his daughter had transformed her trauma into purpose. The medical center would serve as a permanent reminder that suffering could create something meaningful if channeled correctly. Brian had fared differently. After serving 18 months in federal prison for corporate espionage, he was released to a world that had moved on without him. His cooperation with prosecutors had kept him from a longer sentence, but it had also branded him as a traitor in both legitimate and criminal circles. Aaron had ensured that Brian's cooperation became public knowledge, making him unemployable in any field requiring trust or discretion. The young man who had once lived luxuriously on Aaron's generosity now worked minimum wage jobs and lived in a studio apartment on the wrong side of town. "He called me yesterday," Crystal told Aaron as they drove home from the construction site. "He wanted to know if you'd ever forgive him." Aaron's expression didn't change. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That forgiveness has to be earned, and he's never even apologized for what he did to either of us." Brian's downfall had been more complete than even Aaron had planned. The federal conviction made him ineligible for most professional licenses, and his betrayal of Aaron had destroyed his reputation in the business community. More importantly, his testimony against his mother had fractured his remaining family relationships. Miranda's relatives had cut all contact with Brian after learning the extent of his cooperation with prosecutors. In trying to save himself, he had lost both his adoptive and biological families, leaving him truly alone. Seth's fate had been even harsher. His connections to organized crime made prison a dangerous place for him, and his cooperation with prosecutors had made him a target. He spent most of his time in protective custody, isolated from other inmates, and facing decades behind bars. But Aaron's most satisfying victory wasn't the destruction of his enemies. It was the construction of something better in their place. The Haley Foundation, established with Crystal as co-director, had become a major force in supporting abuse victims and funding education for underprivileged children. The foundation's work ensured that Aaron's wealth would create positive change long after he was gone. Aaron had also restructured his business to include employee ownership programs and community investment initiatives. The company that Miranda had tried to loot was now benefiting hundreds of families and strengthening the community Aaron called home. "There's something else," Crystal said as they reached home, a new house Aaron had built for them, free from the memories of Miranda's abuse. "I've been accepted to the pediatric nursing program at Johns Hopkins." Aaron felt a surge of pride that surpassed any business success he had ever achieved. Crystal had not only survived her ordeal, but was positioning herself to help other children who face similar trauma. "When you start?" he asked. "Next fall. But I want to finish the medical center project first. I want to see it completed." That evening, Aaron sat in his study reviewing reports from Todd Mayer, who continued to monitor Miranda and Seth's situations. Both were adapting poorly to prison life, and their appeals had been unanimously rejected by higher courts. Miranda had lost significant weight and was receiving psychological treatment for depression. Her request for early release had been denied, and her earliest possible parole date was still a decade away. Seth faced even grimmer prospects. His gambling debts had followed him into prison, and his creditors had connections throughout the correctional system. He lived in constant fear, dependent on guards for protection, and facing the possibility that his debts might be collected through violence. But the most interesting development involved Brian. Todd's surveillance revealed that the young man had been attempting to reconnect with his biological father, Thomas Lancaster, who had abandoned the family years earlier. "Thomas wants nothing to do with him," Todd reported. Apparently, Brian tried to convince his father to help him get revenge against you. Thomas called Brian a pathetic loser and hung up on him. Aaron wasn't surprised. Brian had spent years believing he was entitled to loyalty and support from people he had betrayed. The reality that actions had consequences was still foreign to him. "There's one more thing," Todd continued. "Brian has been trying to contact journalists about writing a tell-all book about your criminal empire. He's claiming you framed him and his mother." Aaron smiled coldly. "And how is that working out for him?" "No one's interested. Your reputation in the community is too strong, and Brian's credibility is too damaged. Plus, he signed confidentiality agreements as part of his plea deal that would land him back in federal prison if he violates them." The final irony was perfect. Brian's desperation for revenge against Aaron was limited by the very cooperation agreement that had saved him from a longer prison sentence. He was trapped by his own choices, unable to move forward or backward. As Aaron prepared for bed, he reflected on how completely the landscape had changed. A year ago, he had been a successful but naive man who believed that love and generosity would be returned in kind. Now he was a strategist who understood that trust was earned, loyalty was tested, and betrayal was met with overwhelming force. Crystal found him on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. "Any regrets?" she asked. Aaron considered the question carefully. "About the methods? No. About the necessity? Yes. I regret that it had to come to this." "Do you think they've learned anything?" Aaron shook his head. "Miranda blames everyone but herself. Seth is focused on survival. Brian still thinks he's the victim. None of them understand that they created their own destruction." Crystal nodded, understanding that some people were incapable of growth or redemption. "Then you made the right choice." As they stood together in comfortable silence, Aaron knew that his campaign of justice had accomplished more than revenge. It had revealed the true character of everyone involved. Miranda, Seth, and Brian had shown themselves to be exactly what Aaron now knew them to be: selfish, cruel, and fundamentally weak people who would betray anyone for personal gain. Aaron had learned to be something different, strong enough to protect what mattered, smart enough to anticipate threats, and ruthless enough to eliminate them completely. The game was over. Aaron had won not just victory, but transformation. Chapter 8. The New Order. 2 years after Miranda's conviction, Aaron stood before the city council as they voted unanimously to name the new Children's Crisis Center in Crystal's honor. The Crystal Haley Center for Child Advocacy had become the premier facility in the region for treating young abuse victims, funded entirely by Aaron's foundation. "Mr. Haley," Mayor Alyssa Holder said as she presented him with the key to the city, "your generosity has transformed how our community protects its most vulnerable citizens." Aaron accepted the honor, knowing that his reputation had been completely rehabilitated. The narrative of the wronged father who had protected his daughter and exposed dangerous criminals had overshadowed any questions about his methods. Crystal, now finishing her pediatric nursing degree, had become a public advocate for abuse victims. Her story, burning, betrayal, and ultimate triumph, inspired other survivors to come forward and seek help. The most important thing I learned, Crystal told a conference of social workers, is that healing requires justice. Victims can't move forward when their abusers face no consequences. Brian watched Crystal's speech on a laptop in his cramped apartment, his face twisted with resentment. At 27, he looked older than his age, worn down by minimum wage jobs and the constant struggle to survive without the support system he had destroyed. His attempts to rebuild his life had failed repeatedly. Every job application that required a background check revealed his federal conviction. Every potential relationship ended when partners learned about his betrayal of his family. Even his attempts to change his name had been blocked by legal restrictions related to his conviction. Brian had recently been evicted from his apartment and was living in his car, a 15-year-old Honda that had replaced the BMW Aaron once provided. His descent into homelessness seemed inevitable unless something changed. Miranda's situation was equally bleak, but more stable. Prison had stripped away her pretenses and forced her to confront the reality of her choices. She worked in the prison laundry for 17 cents an hour and spent her evenings in her cell, writing letters to Aaron and Crystal that were never sent. She talks about them constantly. Her cellmate, a woman named Robin Hahn, told the prison counselor. She's convinced that if she could just explain herself, they'd forgive her and take her back. The delusion that Miranda maintained, that she was the victim of a misunderstanding rather than the architect of her own destruction, had become a form of mental protection. Accepting responsibility for burning her daughter and destroying her family would have required her to acknowledge a level of evil she couldn't face. Seth's prison experience had been more harrowing. His protective custody status made him a target for guards and inmates alike, and his gambling debts had followed him behind bars. He lived in constant fear, knowing that his creditors had connections throughout the prison system. He's basically serving a death sentence, his lawyer told reporters. The protective custody unit is just delaying the inevitable. Aaron monitored these developments through his network of contacts, but felt no sympathy for any of his former family members. They had made their choices when they chose betrayal over loyalty, cruelty over compassion. The business Aaron had built continued to thrive under his leadership, but he had restructured it to prevent future betrayals. Key positions were filled by people whose loyalty had been tested over years, and access to sensitive information was strictly controlled. More importantly, Aaron had learned to trust his instincts about people. The signs of Miranda's true nature had been there from the beginning. Her casual cruelty to service workers, her obsession with social status, her lack of empathy for others' struggles. Aaron had ignored these red flags because he wanted to believe in the family he was building. Now he understood that character was revealed through actions, not words, and that past behavior was the most reliable predictor of future choices. "You've become harder," Crystal observed one evening as they reviewed foundation business. "Not cruel, but more realistic about people." Aaron nodded. "Experience teaches lessons that theory never could. I learned that some people will take everything you give them and still want more." The lesson had applications beyond his personal life. Aaron's business dealings had become more cautious, his contracts more detailed, his trust more carefully earned. He had learned to distinguish between partners and parasites, between temporary setbacks and fundamental character flaws. The most unexpected development had been Aaron's emergence as a mentor to other men facing similar betrayals. His story had resonated with countless husbands and fathers who had been taken advantage of by people they trusted. The key, Aaron told a support group of divorced men, is understanding that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. You can forgive someone for your own peace of mind while still protecting yourself from future harm. Several group members have been pressured by family and friends to forgive and forget spouses who had betrayed them. Aaron's example showed them that they could move forward without compromising their principles or enabling continued abuse. Forgiveness without consequences is just enabling, Aaron continued. Real forgiveness requires accountability, and accountability requires consequences. The support group had grown into a network of men who helped each other navigate divorce, custody battles, and financial disputes. Aaron's influence had created a community of people who understood that strength wasn't measured by how much abuse you could tolerate, but by how effectively you could protect what mattered. As Aaron's reputation as a protector and advocate grew, he began receiving requests for help from people facing situations similar to his own. The foundation expanded its mission to include support for anyone being exploited by family members or trusted friends. "We're not vigilantes," Aaron explained to his staff. "We're educators. We help people understand their legal rights, their financial options, and their personal boundaries." But Aaron's definition of education was broader than most people's. When a widow contacted the foundation about her son's theft of her retirement savings, Aaron's team didn't just provide legal referrals. They conducted a comprehensive investigation that revealed the son's gambling addiction and drug dealing. When a single mother reported that her ex-husband was coaching their children to lie in custody proceedings, Aaron's investigators documented the manipulation and presented evidence that led to supervised visitation requirements. In each case, Aaron applied the same principles he had used against Miranda, Seth, and Brian: comprehensive intelligence gathering, strategic patience, and overwhelming response to confirmed threats. "You're building an empire," Crystal observed as she reviewed the foundation's expanded operations. "I'm building protection," Aaron corrected, "for people who can't protect themselves." The distinction was important to Aaron. His campaign against Miranda had been personal revenge justified by their crimes. The foundation's work was preventive justice designed to stop future victims from suffering similar betrayals. But the methods were often identical: thorough investigation, strategic planning, and relentless execution until threats were neutralized completely. Aaron had learned that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and weakness invited further exploitation. The world contained predators who viewed kindness as opportunity and trust as vulnerability. Against such people, overwhelming force was the only effective deterrent. The new Aaron Haley was no longer vulnerable to betrayal because he no longer relied on others' goodwill for his security. He had built systems, networks, and resources that could function independently of any individual's loyalty. It was a lonely form of strength, but it was unbreakable. Chapter 9. The Final Verdict. 5 years after the iron burned Crystal's arm, Aaron stood in the cemetery where his adoptive parents were buried, reflecting on how completely his life had changed. The naive man who had once believed that love and generosity would be naturally reciprocated was gone, replaced by someone who understood that respect was earned through strength. Crystal joined him at the gravesite, now a licensed pediatric nurse working at the children's hospital Aaron had endowed. She carried herself with confidence that came from surviving the worst betrayal imaginable and emerging stronger. "I got a letter from Brian yesterday," she said, handing Aaron an envelope. "He's asking for money." Aaron read the letter without surprise. Brian had been living in his car for 3 months and was desperate enough to beg for help from the family he had betrayed. The letter was full of self-pity and vague promises of changed behavior, but contained no genuine acknowledgement of his crimes or apology for his betrayal. "He says he's learned his lesson," Crystal continued. "He promises he's different now." Aaron tore the letter in half and dropped the pieces in a trash can. People like Brian only learn temporary lessons. As soon as the pressure is off, they revert to their true nature. The decision to refuse help wasn't cruel, it was educational. Brian needed to understand that actions had permanent consequences and that betrayal destroyed trust forever. Any assistance from Aaron would only teach Brian that his victims were weak enough to be exploited repeatedly. Miranda's situation had grown more desperate as her appeals continued to fail. Her lawyer had approached Aaron's representatives multiple times, suggesting that his testimony about her character might help with parole hearings. Aaron's response was always the same. Miranda had revealed her character through her actions, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that reality. "She's still blaming everyone but herself," Crystal observed. "Her letters to me are full of complaints about the prison conditions and how unfairly she's been treated." Aaron wasn't surprised. Miranda's narcissism made it impossible for her to accept responsibility for her choices. She would spend the remainder of her sentence convinced that she was the victim of a conspiracy rather than the architect of her own destruction. Seth had finally met the violent end that everyone had anticipated. His gambling creditors had reached him despite protective custody, and he was found dead in his cell under circumstances that were officially ruled as suicide but clearly indicated otherwise. No great loss, Todd Mayer had reported when delivering the news. The world is safer without predators like him. Aaron felt no satisfaction in Seth's death, but no sadness either. The man had chosen to live as a parasite, destroying vulnerable people for personal gain. His violent end was simply the logical conclusion of a life spent making enemies. The foundation Aaron had built continued to expand its reach, helping hundreds of families avoid the kind of exploitation his own family had suffered. The work had given Aaron a sense of purpose that went beyond personal success or revenge. "We're opening a new facility in Portland," Crystal reported as they drove home from the cemetery. "A residential treatment center for children who've been abused by family members." Aaron nodded, pleased that his daughter had found a way to transform her trauma into positive change. Crystal's strength came not from forgetting what had happened to her, but from using that experience to protect others. "Any word from your grandmother?" Aaron asked. Crystal smiled. "She's doing well. Still grateful that you stood up for me when no one else would." Ethel Lancaster had become a strong supporter of the foundation after witnessing how Aaron had protected Crystal from further abuse. The elderly woman often spoke publicly about the importance of believing children and holding abusers accountable, regardless of family relationships. As they reached home, a fortress-like compound Aaron had built with state-of-the-art security systems, Crystal brought up a topic they had been discussing for months. "I've been thinking about changing my name legally," she said, "from Lancaster to Haley. You've been more of a father to me than anyone else ever was." Aaron felt a warmth that no business success had ever provided. "Are you sure? It's a big decision. You protected me when my own mother tried to destroy me," Crystal replied. "You've supported my dreams and helped me become the person I wanted to be. That makes you my real father, regardless of biology." The adoption paperwork was filed the following week, making Crystal officially Aaron's daughter in law as well as in love. The ceremony was small but meaningful, attended by friends and colleagues who had watched their relationship strengthen through adversity. Brian learned about the adoption through news coverage and sent another letter, this one filled with bitter accusations about Aaron stealing his sister. The letter revealed that Brian still viewed Crystal as property to be claimed rather than a person with agency to make her own choices. Aaron shared the letter with Crystal, who laughed at her former brother's delusions. He still doesn't understand that respect is earned, not inherited. The distinction was crucial. Brian had believed that his biological connection to Crystal gave him certain rights and privileges, regardless of how he treated her. Aaron had learned that true family bonds were built through loyalty, sacrifice, and mutual support, qualities that biology couldn't provide. As Aaron reviewed his empire from his office overlooking the city, he reflected on the completeness of his victory. Miranda would spend the next decade in prison, her social standing and financial security permanently destroyed. Seth was dead, his schemes dying with him. Brian was homeless and unemployable, facing a lifetime of consequences for his betrayals. More importantly, Aaron had built something better from the ashes of their destruction. The foundation helped hundreds of families avoid similar exploitation. The medical center treated thousands of patients annually. The business employed hundreds of people and contributed millions to the local economy. Crystal had not only survived her ordeal, but had transformed it into strength that would help other victims for decades to come. Aaron had learned to distinguish between genuine loyalty and convenient opportunism, between character and performance. The final lesson of his experience was the most important. Forgiveness was not weakness, but it required wisdom. Some people deserved second chances, but others had demonstrated fundamental character flaws that made trust impossible. Aaron had forgiven Miranda, Seth, and Brian in the sense that he no longer carried anger about their betrayals. But forgiveness didn't require him to enable further abuse or pretend that their crimes hadn't revealed their true nature. Do you ever wonder how things might have been different? Crystal asked during one of their evening conversations. Aaron considered the question carefully. If Miranda had been honest about her feelings, if Seth had been a decent person, if Brian had chosen loyalty over greed, we might still be a family. But we would have been living a lie, and the truth would have emerged eventually. The betrayal had been painful, but ultimately liberating. Aaron no longer had to pretend that people loved him when they merely used him. He no longer had to invest in relationships with people who viewed him as a resource rather than a person. "I'm grateful it happened," Crystal said, surprising Aaron with her words. "Not for the pain, but for the truth. Now I know who really cares about me and who I can trust completely." Aaron smiled at his daughter's wisdom. She had learned at 23 what had taken him 52 years to understand: that authentic relationships were built on truth, not convenience, and that protecting oneself from exploitation was a form of self-respect, not selfishness. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Aaron knew that his campaign of justice had accomplished everything he had hoped. His enemies had been defeated completely, but more importantly, he had discovered who he really was when pushed to his limits. He was not the forgiving fool that Miranda had counted on exploiting. He was not the weak stepfather that Brian had expected to manipulate. He was Aaron Haley, a man who protected what mattered, who rewarded loyalty, and who made his enemies regret underestimating him. The iron's mark on Crystal's arm had faded to invisibility, but the strength they had both gained from surviving betrayal would last forever. They had learned that family wasn't defined by blood or law, but by choice, the choice to stand together when the world tried to tear them apart. In the end, Aaron's victory wasn't just about defeating his enemies. It was about discovering that he was strong enough to survive their worst, smart enough to outmaneuver their schemes, and wise enough to build something better from the ruins of their betrayal. The game was over. Aaron had won completely, and unlike his enemies, he would never have to look over his shoulder, because he had learned to distinguish between friends and predators, between love and exploitation. He was finally free. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.